It was a rainy afternoon in 1932 when the Miller family first arrived at Alderwood Heights. The heavy sky above Chicago seemed to reflect the weight of the old apartment building. As the rain drizzled down in soft sheets, the towering structure loomed like a forgotten relic from another time, its faded bricks and crumbling façade standing silently amidst the growing city. Thomas Miller stood outside, staring up at the building, his heart heavy with both hope and unease. "We'll make it work," he muttered to himself, pushing aside the nagging voice that whispered doubts into his mind. Thomas had recently lost his job at a factory after a recent economic downturn, and his wife Margaret had struggled to keep their family afloat with sewing work. They needed a place to call their own. When they found an affordable apartment in Alderwood Heights, they couldn't pass up the chance. The building was cheap, far too cheap for its size and location. They'd been through worse, and this seemed like an opportunity to start fresh. But something about it felt wrong. As they moved into the dimly lit hallway of the building, the smell of mildew and dust clung to the air, and the floorboards creaked loudly beneath their feet. The walls seemed like they were closing in, as though the building itself was watching them, waiting for them to discover its secrets. Margaret, usually the optimistic one, felt a chill run down her spine. "It's just old," she said, trying to convince herself as much as Thomas. "Just needs a little dusting, that's all." But Thomas didn't respond. He could sense it too, the quiet, oppressive atmosphere of the place. The building felt like it was holding something back, like a hidden story buried within its walls. Chapter 2. Strange Occurrences. It didn't take long for the Millers to realize that something wasn't right in Alderwood Heights. At first it was subtle, small things that seemed almost too trivial to mention. The light in the hallway flickered on and off as though it had a life of its own. Margaret would hear footsteps in the empty hall outside their apartment, even though no one was there. The elevator, an old contraption, would occasionally move by itself, as if someone had pressed the button when no one was inside. But these things weren't enough to alarm them, at least not at first. They had a family to take care of and work to do. They tried to brush it off, attributing it to the quirks of an old building. Then things began to escalate. One night in early December 1932, Benjamin, the youngest of the two children, awoke in the middle of the night, screaming, "Mom! Dad! There's someone outside my window!" he cried, trembling in his bed. Margaret rushed into his room, pulling him close. "Shh, sweetie, there's nothing there. It's just the wind," she reassured him, though she could hear the shakiness in her own voice. But when she glanced out the window, the street below was empty. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, Alice, the older daughter, came to her with a disturbing story of her own. "Mom, I saw a man standing in the hallway last night," Alice said, her voice low. "He was just standing there, staring at the door." Margaret looked at her daughter, perplexed. "Are you sure? It was probably just a shadow or maybe someone from another apartment." But Alice was adamant. "No, he was watching me. He looked like he was waiting for something." That afternoon, Thomas decided to take a walk through the building, hoping to figure out what was going on. The hallway was empty, but the deeper he walked into the building, the more the strange feeling of being watched grew. The air grew colder as he passed rooms that were sealed tight, as if no one had lived there for years. When he reached the building's basement, he hesitated. The door to the lower levels had always been locked, but now it was slightly ajar. Curiosity tugged at him. He pushed the door open. The basement was dark and damp, filled with boxes and broken furniture. As he explored deeper, he found something that caught his eye. An old door at the far end of the room. It was hidden behind a stack of boxes, nearly forgotten. But it wasn't the door that disturbed him. It was the strange symbols carved into the wood. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. What was this? He reached out to touch the door but stopped just short of it. A feeling of dread had washed over him. The air felt heavier here, like something was waiting just beyond the threshold. Chapter 3. The Lovell Family. The next few days were filled with increasing unease. The strange occurrences escalated, with the family feeling more and more trapped in their own home. But it was Margaret who decided to take matters into her own hands. She began asking around, trying to learn more about the building's history. The neighbors were tight-lipped, avoiding her questions or changing the subject whenever she brought it up. But then, one afternoon in early January 1933, she met Mrs. Carlson, a very old woman who had lived in Alderwood Heights for decades. Margaret, who was becoming desperate for answers, decided to try once more. "Do you know anything about the Lovels?" she asked, referring to the family who had lived in the building before them. "The family that disappeared a few months ago?" Mrs. Carlson's eyes widened, and her wrinkled hands gripped the edge of her chair. "The Lovels?" she whispered, as though speaking their name aloud would invite something terrible into the room. "That family, they were different. Strange things happened to them. Things no one could explain. I don't know much, but they were always involved in odd activities. They kept to themselves. But there were rumors." "What rumors?" Margaret asked, leaning in. "They say the Lovels were involved with things beyond this world. People spoke of rituals, strange happenings, things that couldn't be explained," Mrs. Carlson said in a low, trembling voice. "And then one day they were just gone. No one knows where they went or why. It was as if they vanished into thin air." Margaret's heart began to race. It wasn't the first time she had heard strange rumors about the Lovels, but hearing them from Mrs. Carlson made them feel much more real. Determined to learn more, Margaret returned to the building's archives. There she uncovered old photographs and letters from the Lovell family. Everything pointed to a family that seemed perfect on the surface. Wealthy, well, respected and involved in the community. But as Margaret sifted through the papers, she discovered something chilling, a journal belonging to Charles Lovell, the head of the family. Chapter 4. The Journal. The journal was old, its leather cover cracked and worn. As Margaret flipped through its pages, she found the writings to be increasingly unsettling. Charles Lovell wrote about his family's success and prosperity, but as the entries grew darker, it became clear that there was more going on behind the scenes. "I've made a terrible mistake," one entry read. "The price of power is too great. I should never have agreed to it, but I had no choice. We have made a pact that will bind us to this place until the end of time." Margaret's hands trembled as she read the words. It seemed that Charles had made some kind of deal, a pact with something dark and sinister. He spoke of sacrifices and of a time when the family would have to disappear to fulfill their end of the bargain. "They are coming for us," the last entry read. The handwriting grew more erratic as the ink blotted and smeared. The weight of the words hit Margaret like a punch in the gut. The Lovells hadn't just disappeared, they had been taken, dragged into some unknown fate by forces beyond their control. And now those same forces were coming for her family. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. That night on January 15th, 1933, the Millers were plunged into the depths of terror. As they tried to sleep, the house seemed to come alive with strange sounds, the whispers in the hallways, the creaking of floorboards, and the faint sound of footsteps moving just beyond their door. Alice and Benjamin woke in fear, crying out for their parents. And as Thomas looked around, the shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to grow longer and darker, as though they were waiting to swallow him whole. Then something worse happened. Margaret, desperate for answers, went to the basement with the journal in hand. She knew they had to confront whatever was lurking in the building. As she stood before the door with the strange symbols, she felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't bear to open it, but she had no choice. Thomas, who had followed her down, stood beside her. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret nodded, her grip tightening on the journal. "We have to end it, for the children." With a deep breath, they opened the door. Chapter 6. The Breaking of the Curse. The basement was colder than ever. The symbols on the floor seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with an eerie energy. As they stepped into the room, the air grew heavier, pressing down on them. Shadows danced on the walls, and for a moment, it seemed as if the very room itself was alive. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. And then they heard it. A voice, deep and ancient, echoed from the shadows. "You should never have come here," the voice hissed. "This place belongs to us now." Epilogue. The Legacy of Alderwood Heights. It was late in 1933 when the Miller family finally left Alderwood Heights. They never spoke of the events that transpired within the building, but the nightmares that haunted their sleep would never fade. The apartment stood empty once more, waiting for the next family to move in. And the building? It remained as it had always been, silent and watching, but the pact was not over.